So we're going to be in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 20. What I want to talk about today is actually a problem with Easter. Okay? Or to be more specific, it's some problems with the resurrection. 3. First of all, Christianity has a problem as a faith or a religion. Second, skeptics have a problem, and I mean particularly as historians. There's actually 3 of them. There's a historical problem, a political problem, and a sociological problem. And then lastly, many of us have a problem too as modern American Christians. Okay, so Christianity has a problem. Skeptics have a problem. We have a problem. I want to talk about all those 3 things. This is going to be a lot to get through. But I think it's going to be, this is what I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I'm hoping that it's going to be helpful. So, let's start with Christianity. It has a problem. If you look at 1 Corinthians 15, what I'd like to do is just read selective verses. So if you flip forward in your Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians. Okay? Chapter 15, this is a very famous chapter, and it's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. What I want to do is just highlight a few key verses for you, but I'd really like it if you follow along in here so that you see it. So first of all, in verse 1, this is Paul. He says, I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the gospel that I preached to you. So the gospel is good news. This is the message. And then right after that, he says, this would be in verse 3, what I received, I delivered to you. This is of the message, the gospel message that I received, I gave to you. And I'm not starting all over. No. Okay. Skeptics have a problem too. Specifically, there's a specific kind of skeptic who's a very good skepticism. They're historians. They actually don't just take like legends and stories of what happened in the past. They actually do their work and they try to dig into it to figure out what happened. Okay? Those historians have 3 problems actually. Just a second. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to talk about all 3 problems. There's a historical problem, a political problem, and a sociological problem. What I'm going to do, and this is the part where you're going to have to really pay attention. This is a book that I've been reading for a while. It's called Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. It's about 750 pages long. I've told you guys about it in the past, and I've been like, hey, you don't really need to read this. But I would actually encourage you. My middle son, Micah, he's like 31, never been to college. He's like, Dad, I'm reading the best book. And it's this book. He is working his way through this book. He's like, it's really slow going, but it's amazing. Okay, now listen, I'm going to try to summarize the first 550 pages of this book in about 5 minutes. So that's about 100 pages a minute. So I'm going to speak with a little bit of a broad brush, but I'm going to tell you what this says, because I doubt most of you are going to go read it. And it's actually really, really significant. Okay, follow me? N.T. Wright says there's a historical problem that historians need to reckon with, and he goes, they actually haven't done a good job of it. Now, here's what I mean by this. Okay. N.T. Wright, and historians will agree with this, absolutely, says that what history really traces is a history of ideas. In other words, you can trace ideas through history, just like you can trace events through history. So when there's a revolution that happens, one of the things you learn in history class, high school, it's like, guys, there were always causes, right? So in other words, things don't generally just happen. They happen because there were causes, there were things that led up to it, and the same thing happens with ideas. So when somebody has an idea, you can actually look in history and you can see a lot of times where those ideas came from and how they evolved to what you get. Okay? Now listen, the same thing is true when we look back into history about ideas, okay, of, here's the big question, what happens after death? If you went to college or have a friend who went to college, you have probably heard lots of people say that lots of ancient cultures had ideas of dying gods and resurrection. Have you heard that? N.T. Wright says that's garbage. All right? And then he's like, let's go look at what everybody in the past has said. And he literally traces it. It's exhausting. And he's like, no, let's read that. He's read it all. And he's like, I invite everybody to go read all of this. And he basically summarizes all these things. So I'm going to give you the summary really quick. First of all, when you look historically at the question of what happens after we die, there is almost always a range of answers. And on the one end of the spectrum is what I would call more folk or folklore. Okay? Stories. These are the things the uneducated people tell, and most of people through most of history have not been super educated. So the folklore, like this is where you get the myths. This is where you get the gods. Okay? This is where you get all the stories. Okay? And what's interesting is when you look at all the ancient stories, there is basically, everybody knows that death is a really big thing. And two, once people die, they don't come back. All right? And when you say, well, is there anything after death? In the Greek stories, you actually get, did anybody know? Hades. Okay? It's the underworld. And you find something similar to this in the Hebrew stories. Okay? Sheol. All right? Now, so what he says is basically, look, so at that point, he's like, hey, you read the Old Testament and peer as far back in as you can get, and you see these references in the Psalms to Sheol, to the grave, and it looks a lot like Hades language, where maybe if there's some kind of life after death, it is a bleak, like half-life, where everybody's almost like a shadow of themselves, not much is happening. And it's definite, you're not coming back from that place. Okay? It is not a good place.
You see this in the Psalms where I think it's David's like, can I worship you from beyond the grave?
Yep.
Like,
no, it's like the grave is this massive like sinkhole whirlpool. And so all ancient culture had that feel. Now, as you look at folklore side of culture, there's maybe glimpses that something comes after. Now, what's interesting is you start to push onto the educated end of the spectrum. People that studied, that trained, that thought very critically. Who's the big one in the ancient world? Plato. Plato is like one of the giant thinkers. And as you push towards that end of the spectrum, Plato actually looks... and he's going to quote other philosophers who are like quoting Plato. But basically what he says, I'm going to do this faster. He says Plato is basically saying there may be something after death. But it's not like many gods. If there is a divinity, there's one divinity. And it's not going to be embodied. It's not going to be... we need to actually get unencumbered. Plato talks about forms, and he talks about ideas, and he talks about being. And what you find in Plato, this kind of Platonic ideal, is after we die, if somebody is particularly thoughtful and virtuous, perhaps they can arise to the level of divinity, maybe, okay, but it's disembodied. Now here's the big point. There's absolutely nothing in ancient history that looks like resurrection as the Jews thought of it. Now, go back to the Jews. The Jews had Sheol, but as you read your way through the Old Testament, the Jewish writing, as you start to push towards the prophets, you actually find them developing in a different direction than Plato. They're developing in the direction of Messiah, judgment, resurrection. But here's the thing. the resurrection for them. And by the time you get glimpses of this in Ezekiel, the Valley of Dry Bones. Can these bones live? And he's like, yes, they can. You get glimpses of it in the Old Testament. But the point is, for the Jews, they move in a very different direction. They believe in bodily, physical resurrection, where God is going to judge the world, and then he is going to renew and recreate the world, and they're going to live in this world. So if you asked a Jew about dying and go to heaven, they'd be like, what are you talking about? God is going to come back to this place, redeem this place. We're going to be raised, we're going to be judged, and those who are righteous get to dwell with God. And what N.T. Wright says is that Jewish view, there's nothing like it in the ancient world. Okay? And then he's like, let's read it all. And you just work your way through. Now what happens is when you get to the Christian period, you find that all of the Christian authors up until the middle 200 to 300 AD are all saying this same type of thing. Except they develop it even further, and they actually say that Jesus was raised. So this is where they split even from the Jews. The Jews looked ahead and said there's a resurrection. The Christians said the resurrection's already happened for one person, Jesus. And it's going to happen in the future for everybody else who follows him. But that was a radical innovation. All right, so and then what happens is about 300, you start finding some people who identified as Christians who start writing about resurrection as if it's just a metaphor, and they actually move back in a Platonic direction. It's the Docetists and the Gnostics. And they're like, no, that was all just like a metaphor. It was like it didn't really, Jesus wasn't even a real person. He just looked like it. So of course he didn't die. Of course he wasn't raised. It's all intellectual. Okay. You follow that so far? That's like 550 pages. Now here's the problem. N.T. Wright says, where did that idea come from? First of all, the Jewish idea, you can see some evolution, but then what happens at the end of it, there was nobody at the time of Jesus. And he's like, guys, we have so much writing from the ancient people in that time. We know of not a single thinker anywhere that had the idea that the Messiah was going to die and then be raised up in advance, resurrection of one person in advance, and then everybody else. That idea of a split resurrection, it's nowhere on the scene. And he goes, historians need to ask themselves, where did that come from? And he said that is a really hard question to answer. Okay? That's the first problem. Do you see the historical problem? Does that make sense? Okay. Second problem, political problem. All right? And it has to do with Jesus being Messiah and Lord. Okay? The fact that Jesus claimed to be Messiah and Lord put him in conflict, not just with the Jews, but also with Rome. What I want to do is I want to read you just little sketches from 10 pages that's going to show you how that Messiah thing was a problem. All right, you ready? Okay. This is N.T. Wright writing. He says, okay, the central argument of this book is now complete. The future hope of the early Christians is very focused. It's thoroughly Jewish because it believes in the resurrection, but it's been redefined beyond anything that Judaism had said or would say later. This idea of single resurrection up front, the rest of resurrection to follow later. This phrase, that God made Jesus both Lord and Messiah, those two words, Kyrios and Christos. Kyrios is Lord, Christos is Messiah. These were the key words used by the first Christians to express what they now believed about Jesus. They thought that he was Lord and Messiah. Both of these are surprising. Now listen to this. Those two words, Lord, Messiah, are surprising, not to say shocking, when used of someone who was recently executed by the Romans. This shock is the pivot of the argument in the present chapter. He's going, we don't realize how shocking it would have been for them to still call Jesus Lord and Messiah after he'd been crucified. Okay? The argument at this point proceeds in 3 stages. Early Christianity was thoroughly messianic, shaping itself around the belief that Jesus was God's Messiah, Israel's Messiah. That's the first point. But messiahship in Judaism, such as it was, never envisioned somebody doing the sorts of things that Jesus had done, let alone suffering the fate that he had suffered. Follow me on this? What he's saying is, in all of the Old Testament, you do not see this idea that the Messiah, not obviously, it has to get read back in by the Christians. The Jews, prior to the Christians, you don't find any Jews predicting that the Messiah is going to suffer and die, let alone be raised. Okay? The historian must therefore ask, why on earth did early Christians make this claim about Jesus? And why did they reorder their lives accordingly? Okay. The evidence is overwhelming. Jesus was firmly known as Messiah right across the board in early Christianity. He says some people are going to be tempted to say, Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. Christians didn't believe that. They thought it was a moral teaching. And he says, no, they didn't. Okay? He says, all the evidence, we see evidence that showed the earliest stuff we have about Jesus shows him and his disciples all thinking that he's the Messiah. Now listen, how could that be? Well, one possible reason is that Jesus was regarded as Messiah throughout early Christianity. One reason why he was regarded that way is that he had regarded himself that way. That he had said and done things which pointed towards his belief that he had such a vocation. So you can think right now, do I see stuff in the scriptures that made it look like Jesus thought he was the Messiah? And if you've done any reading, you should be like, I think so. Okay? However, any effect that this teaching might have had in convincing his followers during his public career would have been completely undone by his shameful death at the hands of the Roman authorities. Okay? In other words, what he's saying is, even if Jesus was convinced that he was Messiah, and his disciples were convinced that he was Messiah, when the Romans executed him, they would have been like, oh, he is not the Messiah. Because they had no notion of a Messiah being resurrected, let alone dying. Okay? Now, the Messiah, listen to this. Okay, the very Judaisms of the time do not conform to what Jesus did and said, still much less what happened to him. The Messiah was supposed to win the decisive victory over the pagans, to rebuild or cleanse the temple, and in some way or other to bring true God-given justice and peace to the whole world. What nobody expected was for the Messiah to die at the hands of pagans instead of defeating them, to mount a symbolic attack on the temple, warning it of imminent judgment instead of rebuilding and cleansing it, and then to suffer unjust violence at the hands of the pagans instead of bringing them justice and peace. The crucifixion of Jesus, understood from the point of view of any onlooker, whether sympathetic or not, was bound to have appeared as the complete destruction of any messianic pretensions or possibilities that he or his followers might have had. The violent execution of a prophet, which uncontroversially was how Jesus was regarded by many, still more a would-be Messiah, did not say to any Jewish onlooker that he really was the Messiah at all, or that Yahweh's kingdom had suddenly come. It said powerfully and irresistibly that he wasn't and it hadn't. Now, this is the key thing. Is everybody following this? Caroline, is this tough? You hanging in there? Yes? Tough? Yes? You're hanging in there. Okay. We can see this clearly enough if we imagine for a moment the situation after the death of two of the most famous would-be messiahs of the period. So remember, there were other people that claimed to be Messiah, that were perceived as Messiah. And we know what happened to them. So some people thought John the Baptist was Messiah. And what happened after he died? His followers kind of dissipated. Now there was another one named Simon Bar Giora that led the first revolt in AD 66 through 70, the Jewish Maccabean revolt. This is when Masada happened. Actually, Masada may have been later. This was when the the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Now listen to this. But they had a Messiah. They had somebody they thought was the Messiah, claimed to be. So Simon Bar Giora was perceived to be the Messiah, but he was killed at the climax of Vespasian's triumph in Rome. All right, here's how it happened. And we know this because Josephus wrote about it. So take Simon, for example. The year is AD 70. Vespasian has become the emperor. Titus, his son and heir, has obliterated the Jewish rebellion, destroying Jerusalem in the process. He returns to Rome to celebrate a magnificent triumph pictured in stone to this day on Titus's arch at the east end of the Forum. The bedraggled Jewish prisoners are displayed within the pageant. So in other words, they march their prisoners through this arch, okay? And they've got like actors and they're dramatized. They're doing like a drama where they actually have prisoners in the drama. This is like the drama. It's like, here's how great Rome is. You know, here's the enemy people. Look, we've captured them. And what they're doing is they lead them up, and guess what they're going to do with the enemies? They're going to kill them. Okay? The bedraggled Jewish prisoners are publicly displayed within the pageant, telling the story of the war. They're not doing anything. They're just getting marched along. The spoils, particularly from those of the temple, are carried through the city. Finally comes the conquering heroes, Vespasian himself, followed by Titus, with Titus's younger brother Domitian riding behind him. But there remains one ceremony. The triumphal procession stopped in front of the temple of Jupiter Calopatonus. It was an ancient custom to wait there until it was announced that the enemy general had been put to death. So literally they've kept him alive to bring him back to Rome so they can put him to death in front of everybody. This was Simon, son of Gioras, who had featured in the pageant among the prisoners, and then with a halter thrown around him, he was dragged to the spot beside the Forum where the Roman law requires that criminals under sentence of death be killed. The people leading him scourged him, whipped him as they went, and then they killed him. Right there publicly. And after the announcement of his death, the universal shouts of rejoicing that followed, the princes began the sacrifice, which had been daily offered. They went back to the palace. The city of Rome held a celebration. Now listen to this. For its day of victory in the war against his enemies, for the stopping of civil disturbances, for the beginnings of hope of prosperity. In other words, why do we fight this war? To put down disturbers. We're for peace, and we maintain peace. And when the triumphal ceremonies were over, the empire of the Romans had been established on the firmest possible foundation. Vespasian decided to set up a temple of peace. Okay? So the Romans, everything they were doing was about peace, peace, peace. You remember what Jesus says when he shows up in John? Peace, peace, peace. That can mean shalom, but it can also mean pax, 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 pax. Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now listen. Let me tie a bow on this. Roman victory, Roman justice, Roman empire, Roman peace, all because the Jewish leader had been killed. And he says, it's an interesting parallel to the Christian claim that salvation had come into the world because the Messiah had died. But we will let that pass for a moment. Instead, as our immediate task, imagine 2 or 3 of Simon's supporters. This is the crux. He says, if you believe that somebody was the Messiah and all of a sudden you saw this happen to him, now listen, he said, imagine 2 or 3 of you somehow survived, you're hiding in caves or in secret cellars, and a few days later, suppose one of them says, his name is Blake, he's like, actually, I think that Simon really was the Messiah. Okay? The kindest of the others would say, Blake's lost his mind. Because he was just executed. Okay? The Romans won, not us. Okay? The statement could also be understood as heavily ironic. If he really was the Messiah, then our God really has forgotten us. But in either case, if pressed, and this group of people said, no, Simon was really the Messiah, now we should launch a movement which hails him as such, which declares to our fellow Jews that Yahweh's anointed has been in their midst and has established the kingdom at the very moment when Caesar's kingdom seems more firmly established forever. He says that would be absolute lunacy and nobody would believe it. And we know that because other times this exact same thing happened and nothing came of it. He lists several instances. So the question is, for the historian, okay, how come in this case they did believe it? The Jewish beliefs about a coming Messiah and the deeds such a figure would have expected to accomplish came in various shapes and sizes, but they did not include a shameful death which left the Roman Empire celebrating its usual victory. So why then did the early Christians acclaim Jesus as Messiah when he obviously wasn't? He too had been scourged. He'd been dragged through the streets and executed. His execution was public. Faced with his death, why would any of his followers have dreamed of saying that he was Messiah? And moreover, as we shall see, of reordering their worldview around this belief so that Christianity was launched precisely as a messianic movement, albeit with significant differences. Listen. Let me sum this up. In the same way that in the history of ideas, all of a sudden there was a new idea about resurrection that popped up out of nowhere. Okay? Very difficult to explain historically. In the same way, when the Romans did this, something exploded with people actually going, oh my gosh, he is the Messiah. And he says, how on earth do you explain that, Mr. Historian? He says, it's incredibly difficult, unless what? Unless it happened. Now here's the third.
Not just it, the resurrection.
Yes, not just the death, the resurrection. In other words, how do you get this idea all of a sudden that one person that the resurrection happens first in one person only? Unless it happened. Second, how do you get the idea that he really was the Messiah in spite of the fact that he was crucified? Well, if he rose, okay, that would do it. Now listen, here's the third thing, and I'm just going to say this. This is like the sociological. Even if it happened, and the handful of people that saw him believed, how come everybody else converted? And the answer, I think, is transform lives. Okay? There's a quote from a guy named Galen, who was not a Christian. He was a doctor in the 2nd century. And he says, we see these people called Christians, and though they have drawn their faith from mere allegories. What he says, when he says allegories, what he means is they're not learned people. So he goes, their Bible doesn't read like a philosophy. It doesn't read like Socrates, okay, or Plato, or any of the great philosophers. It's stories. And there's like lessons from the story. So they've read their Bible, and he says, in spite of the fact that they're uneducated and they're working from stories, okay, they sometimes act like true philosophers, for their lack of fear of death and of what they will meet thereafter is something we can see every day, and likewise their restraint in cohabitating. He said you have people that suddenly their sexual lives are transformed, okay, but more importantly, they weren't afraid of dying. And there were a whole bunch of, so here's the point. I don't know if that's a good summary, but it's really, really significant. There are 3 things that a historian struggles to explain naturally. One is the Christian version of resurrection. It's thoroughly Jewish, but it looks different. Second is this idea of Messiah. Okay? Christianity leans into the fact that Messiah was killed, and there was no expectation of that. And then what happens is immediately after it, the Messiah thing changes, where it's not just he's the Messiah for the Jewish people, he's the Messiah for the whole world. All right? And then the third thing, and it would have been right after the Romans had done the one thing that would have convinced everybody he wasn't the Messiah. And then the third thing is you had people start getting on board and their lives were transformed. Those three things are a problem for a historian because there is no good natural explanation. And what that means is a problem for which there is no natural explanation could also be evidence of a supernatural one. You see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is those things I've just been telling you are actually evidence that something extraordinary happened, and the most likely thing it was is that Jesus really is alive. Third thing, there's a problem for us, modern Americans. Most of us don't really believe Jesus is alive. Modern Christian Americans, most of us, many of us, are almost indistinguishable from the pagans we live around. Our lives aren't reordered. We live just like the pagans. We chase the same thing non-Christians do. Paul makes a really interesting statement in Philippians. This is chapter 3. It'd be verse 10. He says that I might know Christ and the power of his resurrection. And I think a problem for American Christians is that our lives are oftentimes not very powered by this idea of resurrection. Like, we believe on paper that Jesus rose, but it's not changing our life. We're still pursuing our career. Like, we're still pursuing everything everybody else is pursuing. And that was really different from the early Christians. And Paul seems to think that somehow I can know Jesus and I can be powered by Jesus. My life can be transformed by Jesus. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So if we said, how much transformation are all of us experiencing? I know when I ask the question, how many of you feel like you hear from God? Most of the people are like, not really. How many of you feel like you're being transformed by God? Do you want that? And what I'm getting at, this is the problem for us in America, is that we have kind of settled for a cynical view of Christianity where we believe stuff on paper, but we don't really think that you can know God. We don't really think that you can know Jesus. And we don't really expect our lives to be transformed. Okay? And what I want to do is just say, hey, if you want to be cynical, I don't really know what to do. It's like, okay. But some of you might be tired of being cynical. And you might actually long to have your life be a little bit different. And what I would just say is this. When Paul makes that statement, that I might know Christ and the power of his resurrection, why would Paul be telling the people in Philippi about that? Why would he be saying that if he was not also inviting them that they could experience it too? Listen to what he says. This is what I'm going to close with. Right after this, he says, not that I've already obtained it, not that I'm already made perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Forgetting what lies behind, straining toward what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. And then he says this, let anyone who would be mature think this way. He wants other people to think the exact same way. Only let us hold true what we've attained. Join in imitating me. And keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. So, here's my encouragement. I want you to believe that it's possible to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is real, and to actually start to experience his power of resurrection, resurrecting parts of your life now. And if you're skeptical and you're like, yeah, nobody really knows, okay. But if you're like, I would love to know if that were true, then what I would encourage you to do is to ask, to seek, to start longing, to say, Jesus, if you're really out there, would you show me? Would you reveal yourself to me? I think fundamentally that's what Thomas was getting at when he said, look, unless I can see, I think Thomas wanted to believe, but he knew that he had some hang-ups. And he was entering into this dialogue where he's going, help my unbelief. If you do that, I believe that it will happen. It may take time. But I want to encourage you not to settle for a castrated Christianity, which is often what the American version is. It's like Christianity light. It's Christianity that doesn't cost anything. It is Christianity that does not change the world. It's consumer Christianity. It's easy Christianity. It's fluffy Christianity. It's warm and fuzzy Christianity. But it's kind of shallow. And what I would encourage you is just to say, hey guys, I think there's another Christianity out there. I think Jesus really did rise. I think you can know it. I think there's good evidence for people that look and seek and want to find. Okay.